Did you ever wonder? I do. Did you ever wonder why the sun always rises, but the stars never fall? Why dry land is never satisfied by water? And why fire never says enough?
The wonder of cleaving today. And I'm not talking about a meat cleaver. Or beaver cleaver. I'm actually talking about, a man shall cleave unto his wife and become one flesh, that idea. And of course, those who followed us during the 119 Psalm study, you might recall that the Dalet section starts with "My soul cleaves to the dust, quicken me according to thy word," is that verse that is in my heart, no doubt. And I think about it often. And interestingly, this morning, as I had a similar experience with Jesus, as I talked about yesterday, he said for me to go revisit this idea of cleaving. And as I certainly was doing that with him this morning, and as I looked at it, I immediately my heart, of course, leaped out of my chest, as it often does when I see a word that he has me go check. And the word cleave ends in a kuf. I know you're not shocked, but that told me something. But then, interestingly, and I knew it started with the Dalet, and the Dalet being the fourth letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And you may know that it looks, pretty much like an upside down L when you see it in most Hebrew scripts. But there's something about the Dalet that Jesus wanted me to learn, and so I had to go revisit. Like, I was trying to think of why would the Dalet be the first letter in the word cleave. I also, you might recall from our study in the Song of Solomon, that the beloved, or even the name David itself, it starts with a Dalet. In fact, it's a Dalet and a Vav and a Dalet. And so this idea of love somehow or another is connected to the Dalet. And I know that the idea of servanthood is connected to the Dalet, but I was trying to understand why it would be here in the beginning of cleaving. And the Dalet has got a lot to do with humility. And of course, that idea that in order to need a hug, I guess you got to realize you need that hug. That's how that works. Or in order to, cleave onto your wife, or to cleave to the dust, as David would do, that cleaving to the dust idea is very humble. And of course, David was known for being tremendously humble. And so when I revisited the Dalet, I revisited the idea of why that letter is so humble. And there's a reason that, interestingly, the Jews teach that the Dalet is actually made from the letter Resh. And the letter Resh has to do with your mind or your intellect or your head, or it's often the headwaters of something, or the beginning of something, or the considering of something. But interestingly, what they teach is the Dalet is made from a Resh, which looks about like it, with the exception of there's a Yud on the very end of the L, so to speak, that would go across the left. And that Yud is the idea of humility. In other words, God had to contract himself. The Yud is the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet, so obviously you get the idea of humility there. And God had to greatly contract himself in order to create a finite universe. And I never had really seen the humility of the letter Yud before until I started to study that this morning, and I was like, oh my goodness, look here. So here we're taking this mind and all this consideration and seeing everything in the fear of the Lord. In other words, when you begin to see how big God is, what he's capable of, the power and all that's involved in, like, oh my gosh. And that idea of your mind considering that, you see yourself pretty small and very, very needy, especially if you've been trying to walk with, the impossibility of even wrestling with him and all those things that you have an opportunity to. And all of a sudden I realized that, wow, the Dalet has got so much to do with wisdom, and why David started out with that, my soul cleaves to the dust. In other words, you gotta cling to that idea. And interestingly, he didn't use the word dust like Adam was made out of. He used more like the dust that would be powder. The powder that a fire would leave, or that kind of thing. And Shimei threw that powder and that dust at him and cursed him as he walked by. You may recall the story that David did not forget. Interestingly, he asked Solomon to take his life later for what he'd done, but he was not going to do that while he was alive because he felt like God wanted to humble him, which gets again back to that idea of seeing yourself as this small person. And, I find that that's throughout the 119th Psalm that he does that. But wow, to the idea of cleaving requires humility, right? And my mother, she told my wife when I married her, Robbie is not a hugger. She says it's like hugging a tree. It's just not something he does. And I think, wow, my mother was describing this to my wife, and it obviously, had I really understood the Bible, I would have seen the necessary, how much I need to be able to cleave to my wife. And I was listening to a podcast over the weekend that talked about a wife needs to know her husband's strength and needs to feel his arms around her in order to feel his husband's strength. And like, wow. So when we can be in Jesus's arms and feel his strength, you see, that's the God hug. But that God hug, you only get it if you need it. If you like, Jesus, I really need your strength. Like my soul cleaves to the dust. I really, really, really need your strength. Then all of a sudden, like, wow, then a hug is actually possible. And I begin to see how much my daughters need my hug. My wife needs my hug, and a heartfelt hug. Like, here, I want to flow Jesus' strength through this hug to whoever it is that I can do that with. But in order to do that, obviously, I got to have Jesus' strength, right? The other two letters that are in the word cleave are a bet, which has to do with, obviously, this house that you're going to come into or being separated, which does have to do with a cleaver. But you are being separated, right, as you cling to Jesus, that you're being separated into his household, because his household is separate. And then that letter, kuf, in as far as proximity and time and intimacy and a reflection of Jesus, all those things fit into that idea of cleaving. And I am just really enjoying thinking about those things today and praying that you can go out and hug somebody or receive a hug today and feel the humility of that in view of how big God is and how much we need him. Thanks for listening.
Did you ever wonder?